Unlock Season 14 with the key of imagination. Beyond it is another dimension. A dimension of film, a dimension of scares, a dimension of discussion. You're moving into a land of both humor and substance, of facts and intros. You've just crossed over into the Horrific Podcast. So in this inaugural episode of Season 14, I guess inaugural real episode, we did do the kickoff last time. We're off to a great start.
We're doing great.
We are going to be watching episodes of the Twilight Zone this season that either directly influenced horror movies that came out after them, or that did a lot of things that have since become tropes in horror movies. And I realize that sounds super broad, but I think everybody will get a feel for it when we get more into it. But each week we're doing an episode of the Twilight Zone, and we're going to give kind of a summary of the episode. We're going to talk about sort of the impact it had on horror movies or horror movies that were influenced by it. And then we'll get into kind of specifically what the episode did to be scary that kind of was part of what the impact on horror would be in the future. So, yeah.
And the thing, too, if you've listened to this podcast long enough, you've definitely heard me say, like, this is definitely a Twilight Zone episode on a few movies out there.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
so,
for sure.
So long-time listeners you should understand this thing, this season a little bit better. But that's a good concept, though. I'm excited about this season, man.
Definitely. And as I was kind of, like, doing some reading about it, there are way more movies that were directly, like, basically adapted from Twilight Zone episodes than I had even realized. But we're kind of focusing on ones that you and I are familiar with and that we've maybe talked about in the past, or that are, like, more relevant to the horror subgenre or horror genre in general. But there were some on here where I'm like, oh, wow, that actually sounds good. I need to go watch that movie. So that may be something we include on future seasons.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, this is like, it makes sense why it is like the influence on, or it's been an influence on so many, horror movies, because it's a classic show. Think about the type of shows out around the time. Like, there wasn't a ton like this. And so
it blows my mind that this show existed when it did.
Right. Yeah. Especially with this first episode that we're doing.
So this first episode that we're going to talk about this week is called Living Doll, and it was from 1963, and it was season 5, episode 6. So this is actually pretty far into the run of the original Twilight Zone. And the general premise is that a mom and her daughter arrive home from a shopping trip, and you find out that the daughter has gotten a new doll. The stepdad, who is waiting for them at home, flies off the handle because the mom has spent more money, and really has spent money on the girl who's, I guess, like his adopted daughter. There are so many, like, uncomfortable moments where he is just not being a good dad. Like, it's real obvious that he doesn't care that much about the kid, and that the mom is afraid of him. And pretty much the entire episode takes place inside their house or apartment, whichever it is. And the whole thing kind of escalates from having this doll that occasionally he hears saying something to him that the other people don't hear. But then it's like, it's almost like a Toy Story type thing, where, like, when the mom and the kid are around, it's just a toy with a wind-up toy with a voice box. But when it's him and the doll, all of a sudden it's like threatening him and stuff. And then he's trying to get rid of it and destroy it, but it doesn't work. And then eventually it tells him it's going to get revenge, and it does. So the overall, like, broad brush storyline, you could copy and paste onto a lot of horror movies that have come out since then. And it really reminded me that, like, creepy dolls is kind of its own subgenre. We really didn't get into that in season the 13th.
Right.
But, I mean, Child's Play is kind of the obvious one. You have a billion of those movies. Annabelle and everything that have come along with that, sort of in the Conjuring universe. And then there was even a character in Toy Story 4 that was meant to be kind of like a creepy older doll that was modeled on Talking Tina. So this trope of like the creepy, haunted, or possessed, or somehow supernaturally powered doll is this pervasive thing in horror over a long period of time. And I really feel like this episode basically set the template that a lot of future horror movies would follow.
So kind of tying into that, there's actually there was an interview between Don Mancini and Mental Floss, and Don Mancini is the writer of Child's Play. Child's Play writer Don Mancini told Mental Floss in an interview, "I had seen the Talkie Tina episode of the Twilight Zone, and I knew the killer doll trope. But what I realized was that it had never been done as a feature-length film in the age of animatronics. And according to the Collider article, his first draft was called Blood Buddy, and was more tonally similar to the episode before being rewritten and including more comedic elements, which we all know Child's Play has, with the inclusion of Charles Lee Ray."
That was the guy that did Chucky's voice.
Yeah. And so like he's straight up like, I mean, shout out, like you gotta shout out your influences. And
yeah, definitely. And I think that it's cool that he didn't try to like play it off. You know what I mean? Like exactly. He very much is just saying like, oh no, I totally was influenced by this.
Yeah. And that makes it way worse. Like just own up to it.
Yeah.
That's my thing. It's just like, no, I did. Like let them have like co-writing credits on whatever song or movie or episode or whatever. Let that happen, because you could still get good stuff from this. Just own up to where you got it from. That's my big thing.
Yeah, and I think that with Child's Play, there were definitely enough original twists on the trope that it felt like a creative enough work that it didn't need to hide its influences. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and this concept got them the story, but it didn't give them the whole story. They still had to come up with, a movie that's literally like legendary in the horror movie category. Like everyone knows Chucky, Child's Play. It's just a thing. So like, it's cool that it got them the idea, but like, this obviously didn't have someone killing, someone in the soul going into the doll and that kind of thing. That had to come out, but maybe Blood Buddy would have, and maybe that's a movie we all need.
Right, I'd see it. Not gonna lie.
100%.
But yeah, and I think that there's a lot more room to build out the story in the world more when it's in the context of a feature length film, much more so than when you're dealing with just an episode of a TV show. And so one thing I actually really liked about this was that they kept it super simple, in that the whole show took place inside the house, basically over the course of one day and evening. And the way that they were able to sort of like add more elements to it, or like kind of keep you guessing, even though it was so constrained as far as like the location and the characters, I think it is an example of what Twilight Zone does really, really well. And we've talked about that in the past, how with a lot of times with horror movies, they have like a smaller cast, and that gives you more time with each character to be like empathetic and scared on their behalf. And so this one I thought worked a few different ways with that, but overall it was just like kind of perfect as far as managing like the tone and pace, where it was introducing these new elements of like what Tina was and could do. At first it's just like, oh, is this just a doll that's occasionally going to threaten me? Because that's creepy. Yeah. To all of a sudden, I can't destroy this doll. To all of a sudden, this doll somehow got from that trash can into the daughter's bed on its own, to this doll can actually murder a dude.
Right.
like that progression, was a way of keeping you on your toes and engaged for the whole episode, because you didn't really know what was going to happen next or what it was capable of. And to me, that really felt a lot like a characteristic we see in a lot of like haunting or ghost movies, where, in the beginning, it's this super subtle kind of haunting where like, doors swing open at night, but then it escalates. And because of that escalation, you never really know what's coming next. And that just keeps you like hooked from the beginning. So in addition to sort of the overarching story and trope of sort of the creepy doll or haunted doll, it also had that element of just managing the tone and pace in a way that is useful and that we've seen in a lot of horror movies.
Yeah. And it's definitely something that a lot of the problems I had with certain horror movies was like the pacing of it. Like, it just, you're like, you waited until you had 25 minutes left to get to the good stuff kind of thing. Like the pacing with this was really great. And maybe it's because, like, I don't know why this would make sense, but maybe it's because it's like a TV episode, so they had to get down to the business and like maybe cut some of the fluff out. But like it also had like the other thing that I thought it did really well with this was like you definitely had like good and bad in this episode, meaning like the daughter and the mom, like pure intent, like with what was going, like they just had a good outing, brought this doll home, you know, and then you had the evil, stepdad that was, just a dick because he's infertile. That's what it said online. It did, for the record.
That's amazing.
Yeah. But anyway, but like, so you have that kind of, like, you knew immediately like he was a jerk just from the beginning of the episode. Like that's that was the typical shitty dad, I guess. But like it did, like there was definitely like the good and bad, and like the daughter innocent going on with this, and you have that with the dad, which is what you see in, like, I don't know, trying to think off the top of my head, but like I'm going to use People Under the Stairs as an example of like the people under the stairs didn't harm what's his name, didn't harm the kid in the movie Stairs, because he's in, like, he had pure intent, he was wanting to help kind of thing. And I think that's the same concept here, and that's overall just not from this episode, but they just did it very well in this episode, and I would like to see that happen more in future horror films as well.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, because one of the things I had in my notes was, I feel like if this episode was made today, Christy would have been played by a 23-year-old.
Oh, dude.
And I think that would make it way less compelling, because exactly to your point, having this like kind of innocent child who I thought did like a great job in the role, in like having, believable emotional reactions to everything, really did give you that, like, I mean, this is just a little kid and he's being such an ass and like rejecting her and everything else. Like, it really was, it just made you feel bad. And it was that contrast where you're like, man, this guy is an ass. This girl is just trying to like live a normal life, have her doll. And then all of a sudden you're kind of like on Tina's side for a lot of the episode. And I like it when horror 100%. Movies do that, when they make you think like, okay, well, there's this evil, dangerous thing, but this guy kind of deserves what he's got coming to him, and like that almost adds a little bit of like a thrill to see him get what he's earned.
You're right. Well, street justice,
Yeah, exactly.
No, absolutely. No, I think that's, I think that's a thing. Like, I mean, for me, like, especially like now having a kid, like these kids are they just, unless you're my son and he's cranky all the time, they really do just like have pure hearts. Like you almost have to teach them like evil things in a way, that's why you don't, toss food at them when you're eating, because they learn and then they're throwing food at you in the future. I don't know who did that with my kid, but I'll find out and I'll get them. But, so you do have that, that innocent, like this kid is just living her life, and it's such a shitty feeling to come into a house like that. So that doll technically did do her a favor. But no, I think that this episode also had something that I found more terrifying in this 20-minute Twilight Zone episode than I have in quite a few horror films that we've watched. And that's when the doll straight up says, like, I'm going to kill you. But in that like childish tone. Because for me, with Chucky, it's different because Chucky can move his face and he can look mean and he can look angry, and the tone that what he's saying matches what's happening for the most part. With this, it was just an innocent looking doll, unless you have the fear of dolls, which I get. I'm not fear shaming. It's more terrifying for me to look at someone that's smiling saying I'm going to kill you than someone that looks angry saying I'm going to kill you.
Yes, and I think that a thing that we've talked about over and over again with horror movies is that a movie doesn't have to be high budget to be successful in creating a good horror experience. But I think a key part to doing that is being aware of what your limitations are, what your technology level is, and what your budget is, and then working within those constraints to deliver something effective. And so, this was in the 60s. It was a TV show, not like a huge Hollywood blockbuster film. And so they had constraints to work in. And I thought that they, within those constraints, just did so many subtle good things to make it a good, creepy horror experience. And exactly what you were talking about, where it was like extra creepy because of how unemotional her voice is.
Exactly.
Like when she says things like, you can't hurt me, but I can hurt you, or you'll be sorry. Like, it's not angry. Mm-mm. It's not like she's trying to appear as more than she is. It's just very like calm and matter of fact. And like, factual, I'm not asking for input. I'm just telling you what's about to go down.
Yeah.
And to me, that's so much creepier. And if they had tried to do like, a real like creepy devil voice or something, or if they had tried to like make the face move in a way that wasn't convincing, it would have been ridiculous, not scary. You know what I mean? Like,
no, I feel like they actually great. Yeah.
I feel like everything they did with how they portrayed the doll was very much meant to translate to, you are watching a black and white TV show in the 60s, and they weren't trying to do anything they couldn't pull off. And that's awesome. And I think the Twilight Zone does that a lot. And I feel like a lot of horror movies don't do that, and it makes them less effective.
Well, I think you saying they weren't trying to do things that they couldn't is the best example for like future horror films. That's been a thing that has plagued a lot of films. I feel like what I think that you could take from this is that you can be more simplistic, and maybe not having all the technology tools at your disposal can be a benefit in itself, because if you had the tools to make it where the doll had an angry face, or like, especially in the 60s, like trying to do it, it would have been like a flash or like a fade into it or something, like absolutely would not have, I don't think it would have got the same point over. The thing that creeps me out is a psychopath that you don't know is a psychopath. That's the scary aspect, but to the not doing things that you shouldn't, like, that's when you get into bad CGI, and you're just like, that just ruined what's going on here. We don't have to make their face creepy to make it the whole thing creepy. And except for the movie Annabelle, don't make it a doll like that. Come on. I'm just kidding. Yeah. But no, I think that's the one, it should be one of the biggest takeaways for future horror filmmakers that are watching this, like that, just go within your means and just do it thorough. This was thorough from start to finish, in my opinion.
But another thing that, in kind of thinking about this compared to other like movies that came in the future, I feel like with what we were just talking about, like the experience of watching Child's Play was very different, but that's because they chose to portray Chucky in a very different way. Like his kind of over the top personality and the fact that he was like possessed by this crazy killer, they were going, more into like less of a, I guess, haunting direction with it, and more of a like slasher direction with it.
No, you're right.
And so I think creating that character worked with the technology they had at the time and could pull off. But I think if they had tried to do Talkie Tina that way, then it would have been ridiculous. with where they were at the time in filmmaking. So I even think there's some amount of that same do what you can with what you have to create like a memorable horror experience. Like the spirit of that kind of lives on. But yeah.
No, that's actually really true. That's a good point. I guess it does pertain to the doll, or pertain to the story.
Yeah, and just like the personality and kind of the whole experience of it. But,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, and so then at the end of this one, in the middle of the night, the stepdad hears something. He gets up, checks the daughter's room, and the doll isn't there. He's kind of walking around trying to figure out what's going on, and then that moment when you see him come up on the stairs and you see Tina is there just kind of crumpled up, and he's looking down and then steps on it and just falls all the way down and dies. Like when you first see her there on the stairs was a really good like horror moment.
Yeah.
But then, you know, the way that played out, I really, really enjoyed, because it started off, and like I said before, you were kind of like down to see him get whatever he was going to get.
Yep.
But then that moment when the mom runs down and she looks at the doll and she says, "You better be nice to me."
Yep.
It was like all of a sudden she seemed way less moral and fair and like way less on your side and much more like vengeful and evil.
Yes.
And so the whole episode just closed on like, oh, this doll isn't out to just like protect the daughter. This doll is an evil entity that will continue to cause problems for people. And so this thing that I've kind of been cheering for all of a sudden is not what I thought it was. And I think that is just such a perfect example of a real like creepy stick with you after the fact horror ending that I was just chef's kiss. Well done. This is I had definitely seen this one in the past, but it's been a while, and I had not really thought about it from the terms of, you know, how does this hold up in terms of horror filmmaking? But I loved it, and I'm so glad we did this one first.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think that's the good thing about coming back is like even though we just watched it, I wasn't even thinking about like the "you better be nice to me" like thing that was said at the end. But no, that's a perfect example of like that's true horror. And here's the other reason why I'm perfectly happy with the ending is being that it is the sixth season, like what we've talked about earlier in this episode, like, you know, I don't know if they had to get away with it or what they had to do to get some of the things that were in this done. They may not have had to do anything, but you can't have an episode that's creepy the whole time, have things like "I'm going to kill you" said by, you know, that kind of thing. You can't have that happen, and then the stepdad at the end like realize his ways and like everything's like he's gonna be better, you know, because it's like,
like you can't have it be like a happy ending.
No, because if that's the case, then I don't think we'd be doing this episode, because that's a different feeling altogether. It's like you you broke your promises to me, Tina. But
well, that would be like what we always talk about is like a Hollywood ending versus a horror ending.
Yeah,
you know, this one was not meant to be wrapped up in a way that everyone leaves the theater feeling closer to each other and like the world is a nice and moral place.
Right. Yep.
So yeah, good one to start with. Did you have anything else?
Nope.
Same. I think we wrapped it up in a concise manner that was within the technological limits of what we're capable of providing.
Granted, with all the mistakes I made when reading my part, this is probably only like a 6-minute episode. It took me like 10 minutes to do all that.
They're not going to know that. But yeah, so great way to start this season. We're going to be back next week with an episode, or reviewing an episode called Perchance to Dream. And that one was a little bit earlier on in the Twilight Zone. It was season 1, episode 9 from 1959. So if anybody wants to follow along, that's what we'll be talking about next time. And that's it for today's episode. If you've listened this far, then thank you, and we hope you've enjoyed it. We're always looking for new ideas, so if you have any questions, comments, or movie suggestions, please send us an email at thehorrificpod@gmail.com. or hit us up on the IG. That's what the kids call Instagram. Just search for The Horrific Podcast. Thanks for listening.